When soldiers returned from Vietnam to the streets of Brooklyn, they faced two choices: drown the trauma or transform it into power. Vincent Castellano chose the latter, but that power would carry him to the heights of Miami's cocaine empire, only to watch him bleed out on a kitchen floor from a single accidental stab wound. The irony complete. He was only 22 when he stepped off the bus in Brooklyn in the fall of 1968. His face was scarred from shrapnel, his hands trembled, and behind his eyes lived the ghosts of Vietnamese jungles. He moved back into his old bedroom in his mother's apartment, but the room no longer belonged to him. Nothing did. He woke at 2 a.m, drenched in sweat, sitting upright in sheets that smelled like fear. In his dreams, he was still crossing the muddy waters of the Mekong Delta, watching his friend's head explode beside him, then finding himself on silent streets where the quiet drove him insane. The first months passed in a haze of job applications and rejections. He worked at a paint factory for 3 weeks before getting fired. He started at a construction site and fought with the foreman. The problem was Vincent's nerves. When the foreman yelled at him, Vincent saw his commanding officer in Vietnam. Without thinking, he grabbed the man by the collar and lifted him against the scaffolding. Security pulled him off before he could do real damage, but the message was clear. Vincent Castellano was not built for the civilian world anymore. Sal ran numbers for the Colombo family, a mid-level operator who needed muscle that wouldn't ask questions. He spotted Vincent outside a bar in Bensonhurst, recognized the look in his eyes, the coiled violence barely contained. Sal bought him a drink and made an offer. Vincent accepted without hesitation. The work was simple at first: collecting debts, standing behind Sal during negotiations, making sure people understood the consequences of disrespect. Vincent was good at it. Better than good. He had learned in the jungles how to read fear, how to apply pressure, how to make a man believe death was seconds away without ever throwing a punch. By 1970, Vincent had a reputation. The guys in the neighborhood called him the Vet, with a mixture of respect and caution. He didn't talk much, didn't drink with the crew, didn't chase women. He simply did the work with a precision that unnerved even the made men. When Sal needed someone hurt, Vincent hurt them efficiently. When Sal needed someone scared, Vincent stood in their doorway at 3 a.m. without saying a word, and the message was received. But Sal Russo made a mistake in the spring of 1971. He skimmed money from a shipment of heroin that belonged to a connected guy in the Gambino family. Vincent warned him. Told him it was suicide. Sal laughed it off, said he had friends, said the Gambinos wouldn't touch him. 3 weeks later, they found Sal in the trunk of his Cadillac with 2 bullets in the back of his head. Vincent attended the funeral. He stood in the back, watching Sal's mother collapse over the casket, and felt nothing. Not grief, not anger, just the cold recognition that this world operated on rules as brutal as the jungle. The difference was that here the enemy wore suits and smiled before they killed you. At the cemetery, as they lowered Sal into the ground, Vincent made a decision. He would not die in Brooklyn. He would not end up in a trunk or bleeding out in some alley because he trusted the wrong man. He would build something of his own, something no one could take from him. Miami in 1972 was not yet the cocaine capital of America, but the foundation was being laid. Cuban exiles with connections to South American cartels were quietly establishing networks. The city's geography made it perfect: close to the Caribbean, endless coastline for smuggling, a police force not yet equipped to handle organized crime on this scale. Vincent arrived with $8,000 in cash, the entirety of his savings from working with Sal, and a name given to him by an old contact, Carlos Mendoza. Carlos operated out of a seafood restaurant in Little Havana, a front for moving marijuana from Jamaica and cocaine from Colombia. He was in his 40s, calm and methodical, the opposite of the volatile gangsters Vincent had known in New York. When Vincent walked into the restaurant and asked for work, Carlos studied him for a long time before speaking. He asked about Vincent's military service, about Sal Russo, about why Vincent had come to Miami. Vincent told the truth. He said he wanted to build an empire, and he was willing to do whatever it took. Carlos laughed, but not unkindly. He said empires were built by men who understood patience, discipline, and the art of staying invisible. He offered Vincent a job-moving product, testing his reliability. For 6 months, Vincent worked as a courier, driving shipments from the docks to stash houses across Dade County. He learned the routes, the players, the corrupt cops who took envelopes and looked the other way. He studied the operation with the same intensity he had studied enemy positions in Vietnam, mapping vulnerabilities, identifying opportunities. In early 1973, Vincent proposed an idea to Carlos. The marijuana trade was profitable but bulky and risky. Cocaine was the future. Smaller shipments, higher margins, exploding demand among Miami's wealthy elite, and the disco crowds flooding South Beach. Carlos was skeptical. The Colombians controlled the supply, and they didn't trust outsiders. Vincent argued that he could build a distribution network targeting a different market: the working-class neighborhoods, the construction crews, the dock workers, people who wanted the high but couldn't afford the premium prices charged in the clubs. Carlos gave him a test run. A single kilo to move, however, Vincent wanted. Vincent turned it into $12,000 in profit in 2 weeks. He cut the cocaine, carefully packaged it in small quantities, and sold it through a network of bartenders and cab drivers who moved through the city like blood through veins. Carlos was impressed. He gave Vincent more product, more responsibility. By the end of 1973, Vincent was running his own crew. 6 men who answered only to him, moving 10 kilos a month. But Vincent knew Carlos would never let him rise beyond a certain point. He was useful, yes, but he wasn't Cuban, wasn't connected to the cartels. He was a hired hand, and hired hands stayed hired. So Vincent began to build in secret. He started skimming small amounts from each shipment, just enough to avoid detection, stockpiling his own supply. He cultivated relationships with the Colombian suppliers independently, offering them better terms, faster payment, absolute reliability. By mid-1974, Vincent had enough product and enough connections to break away. He didn't tell Carlos. He simply stopped showing up, disappeared into the sprawl of Miami with his crew and his stash, setting up operations in a warehouse in Opa-locka. He named his organization the Sunshine Syndicate, a deliberately ironic title for an enterprise built on violence and addiction. Carlos sent men to find him. Vincent sent them back with a message: stay out of his territory and there would be no war. Carlos, recognizing the cost of conflict, agreed to an uneasy truce. Vincent had his empire. The Sunshine Syndicate grew quickly. By 1975, Vincent controlled distribution across half of Miami, from Liberty City to Overtown, from Allapattah to Little Haiti. His operation was disciplined, almost military in structure. Each crew had a specific territory, a quota, and strict rules. No selling to kids, no using the product, no attracting police attention. Violators were dealt with immediately and publicly. Vincent didn't tolerate sloppiness, but the competition was brutal. Other crews saw Vincent's success and wanted a piece. Jamaican posses, Cuban gangs, even rival American operators started pushing into his territory. Vincent responded with calculated violence. He didn't kill recklessly, but when he killed, it sent a message. In the summer of 1976, a Jamaican crew tried to take over one of his distribution points in Liberty City. Vincent drove there himself, walked into the house where they were cutting product, and shot the leader in the head without saying a word. Then he sat down, lit a cigarette, and waited for the police to arrive. He was gone before they showed up. But the story spread. The violence weighed on him, though he rarely showed it. Late at night, alone in the penthouse apartment he had bought in Coconut Grove, Vincent would pour a glass of whiskey and stare out at Biscayne Bay, watching the lights of boats moving across the water. He thought about Sal Russo, about the men he had killed in Vietnam, about the men he had killed in Miami. They blurred together in his mind, faces without names, ghosts that never left. Sometimes he woke up gasping, convinced there was blood on his hands, only to find them clean. He tried to build a legitimate life alongside the empire. He invested in real estate, bought a car dealership in Hialeah, opened a nightclub on Ocean Drive. He wore expensive suits, drove a Mercedes, ate at the best restaurants. People who didn't know better thought he was a successful businessman. People who did know better stayed out of his way. Vincent moved through two worlds, and the line between them was a razor edge he walked every day. In 1977, he met Maria Delgado at a charity gala in Coral Gables. She was 24, a school teacher from a respectable Cuban family, beautiful and entirely unaware of who Vincent really was. He told her he was in import-export, which was technically true. They dated for 6 months before he told her the truth. She cried, said she couldn't be with someone involved in that life. Vincent promised to go legitimate, said he was building the legal businesses so he could walk away from the rest. It was half true. He believed it when he said it. They married in a small ceremony in the spring of 1978. Vincent's crew attended, dressed in suits, playing the role of legitimate businessmen. Maria's family was suspicious, but hopeful. Vincent rented a house in Coral Gables, a Spanish-style villa with a pool and a garden far from the streets where his empire operated. For a brief moment, he believed he could have both lives. That he could be Vincent Castellano, the husband and father, separate from Vincent Castellano, the cocaine baron. Their daughter Isabella was born in December 1978. Vincent held her in the hospital and felt something he hadn't felt since before Vietnam: vulnerability. This tiny person was entirely dependent on him, and he realized with sudden clarity that the empire he had built was a threat to her. Every enemy he made, every deal that went wrong, every act of violence increased the risk that someone would come for him and find her instead. He tried to insulate them. He kept Maria and Isabella away from the business, never brought work home, never let his crew know where he lived. But Miami was a small world, and secrets didn't keep. By 1980, people knew Vincent Castellano had a family, and in the cocaine trade, family was leverage. July 11th, 1981 started as an ordinary Saturday. Vincent was at the warehouse in Opelika, meeting with his lieutenants about a shipment coming in from Cartagena. Maria had taken Isabella to a birthday party at Dadeland Mall, one of the largest shopping centers in Miami. Vincent had argued against it, said it was too public, too risky. Maria had insisted. She was tired of living in fear, tired of the restrictions. She wanted their daughter to have a normal childhood. At 2:17 in the afternoon, two men walked into the Crown Liquors store at Dadeland Mall, carrying automatic weapons. They opened fire, killing two Colombian drug dealers who had been setting up a meeting. It was a targeted hit, part of the cocaine wars that were tearing Miami apart. But in the chaos, the shooters panicked. They ran through the mall, firing indiscriminately. Shoppers screamed and scattered. Children were trampled. And in the parking lot, as Maria was buckling Isabella into the car seat, a stray bullet shattered the windshield. The bullet didn't hit Maria directly. It struck the rearview mirror, sending shrapnel into her neck. She collapsed across the front seat, blood pooling on the leather. Isabella, strapped in the back, screamed. A security guard found them 2 minutes later and called for an ambulance, but Maria bled out before it arrived. She was 28 years old. Vincent was at the warehouse when he got the call. He didn't remember the drive to the hospital. He remembered walking into the emergency room and seeing Isabella sitting with a social worker, her dress covered in her mother's blood. He remembered the doctor telling him Maria was dead. He remembered the sound that came out of his throat, something between a scream and a moan, a noise he didn't recognize as human. The funeral was held at a Catholic church in Little Havana. Hundreds of people attended, many of them Maria's family and friends who still believed Vincent was a legitimate businessman. His crew stood in the back, silent and angry. Vincent sat in the front row, holding Isabella, staring at the casket, and felt the last piece of his humanity tear away. The shooters had been caught. They were part of a rival Colombian crew. Within a week, both were dead, along with their boss and 3 of their associates. Vincent handled it personally. He wanted them to know why they were dying. After Maria's death, something in Vincent changed. The careful discipline that had defined his operation gave way to recklessness. He expanded aggressively, taking territory without regard for consequences. He started using cocaine himself, just a line here and there to stay sharp, but it became more frequent. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly. His crew noticed but said nothing. You didn't question Vincent Castellano. Isabella lived with Maria's sister in Coral Gables. Vincent visited when he could, but he was a ghost in her life. He paid for everything, made sure she had the best schools, the best care. But he couldn't bear to be around her for long. She looked too much like her mother. Every time he saw her, he remembered Maria bleeding out in the parking lot, and the rage returned. By 1983, the Sunshine Syndicate was moving 50 kilos of cocaine a week, generating millions in revenue. But the operation had become sloppy. Vincent's paranoia and drug use made him erratic. He trusted fewer people, killed more frequently, and left bodies where they would be found. The message was clear: cross Vincent Castellano and die. But the bodies also attracted attention. The DEA had been building a case against Vincent for 2 years. They had informants inside his organization, wiretaps on his phones, surveillance on his properties. In March 1983, they arrested 4 of his lieutenants in a coordinated raid. 2 of them flipped immediately, offering testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Vincent knew the walls were closing in. He started liquidating assets, moving money offshore, preparing escape routes. He had fake passports, bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, a villa in Costa Rica where he could disappear if necessary. But he wasn't ready to run yet. He had built the Sunshine Syndicate from nothing, and walking away felt like surrender. So he kept operating, kept moving product, kept believing he could outmaneuver the federal government. In June 1983, his most trusted lieutenant, Eddie Morales, came to him with a proposal. There was a massive shipment coming in from Colombia, 200 kilos, the largest they had ever handled. If they could move it successfully, the profit would be enough to sustain the organization, even if Vincent had to go underground. Eddie had arranged everything: the pickup, the distribution, the buyers. It was a sure thing. Vincent should have seen the trap. Eddie had been acting strange for weeks, nervous and evasive. But Vincent's judgment was clouded by cocaine and paranoia. He approved the deal. The shipment was scheduled to arrive on August 15, 1984, at a private dock in Key Biscayne. Vincent decided to oversee it personally, a decision he would not survive. The night of August 15, 1984 was humid and oppressive, the kind of Miami night where the air felt like water. Vincent arrived at the dock at midnight with Eddie and 3 other crew members. The boat was late, but that wasn't unusual. They waited in the warehouse adjacent to the dock, drinking beer and playing cards. Vincent snorted a line of cocaine to stay alert. His hands were shaking. The boat arrived at 1:30 in the morning. The crew unloaded the shipment quickly, stacking the kilos in the warehouse. Vincent inspected a few bricks, testing the product. It was high quality, exactly what the Colombians had promised. He felt a surge of relief. Maybe this would work. Maybe he could pull off one last score before disappearing. Eddie had been an informant for 6 months. The entire shipment was a setup. Federal agents flooded the warehouse shouting commands, weapons drawn. Vincent's crew froze, hands in the air. But Vincent didn't freeze. He ran. He bolted through a side door, sprinting across the dock toward the water. Behind him, agents shouted for him to stop. He ignored them, his mind racing through escape scenarios. If he could reach the boat, if he could get to the water, maybe he had a chance. But his legs felt heavy. His lungs burned. The cocaine had sapped his endurance. He made it to the edge of the dock before he slipped. His foot caught on a coil of rope and he fell hard, slamming his shoulder into the wooden planks. Pain shot through his arm. He tried to stand, but 2 agents tackled him, forcing him face down. They cuffed his wrists, read him his rights. Vincent lay there gasping, tasting blood in his mouth, and thought, this is how it ends. But it wasn't. During the struggle, one of the agents had lost his knife, a tactical blade used for cutting evidence bags. In the chaos of the arrest, no one noticed it fall. Vincent, handcuffed and lying on the dock, felt the blade beneath his chest. He palmed it carefully, slipping it into his sleeve. The agents hauled him to his feet and marched him toward a waiting van. They would take him to federal holding, process him, and begin the long march toward trial and life in prison. Vincent sat in the back of the van, hands cuffed behind him, and worked the knife free. He didn't have a plan. He was acting on instinct, the same survival mechanism that had kept him alive in Vietnam. If he could cut the cuffs, if he could create a distraction, maybe he could escape during the transport. It was a desperate idea, but he had nothing else. The van hit a pothole and Vincent lurched forward. The knife slipped in his grip and the blade sliced across his left wrist, severing the radial artery. Blood sprayed across the metal wall of the van. Vincent gasped, suddenly aware of what had happened. He tried to apply pressure, but with his hands cuffed behind him, he couldn't reach the wound properly. The blood pumped out in rhythmic spurts, soaking his shirt, pooling on the floor. He shouted for the agents in the front seat, but they didn't hear him over the engine noise. Or maybe they ignored him, thinking he was trying to cause trouble. Vincent felt the warmth spreading across his back, felt his vision starting to blur. He had maybe minutes before he lost consciousness. He thought about Isabella, about Maria, about all the people he had killed and all the lives he had destroyed. He thought about Vietnam, about Sal Russo, about the empire he had built, and the empire that had consumed him. The van pulled into the federal building's underground garage 20 minutes later. When the agents opened the back doors, they found Vincent Castellano slumped against the wall, unconscious and barely breathing. They called for an ambulance, but by the time the paramedics arrived, he had lost too much blood. He died in the back of the van at 3:47 in the morning, surrounded by federal agents who had spent years trying to bring him down, only to watch him bleed out from a self-inflicted wound. The official report listed the cause of death as accidental. The media called it poetic justice. The man who had built a cocaine empire through violence had died from a kitchen knife in the back of a police van, brought down not by rivals or law enforcement, but by his own desperation. The irony was not lost on anyone. Vincent Castellano was buried in a small cemetery in Kendall. Fewer than 20 people attended the funeral. His crew had scattered, most arrested in the same raid that took him down. Maria's family didn't come. Isabella, now 5 years old, stood with her aunt and stared at the casket without understanding what had happened. She would grow up knowing her father had been a criminal, but she would never know the full truth, the violence, the bodies, the empire built on addiction and death. Her aunt made sure of that. The Sunshine Syndicate collapsed within months. Without Vincent's leadership, the organization fractured into rival factions that destroyed each other. The warehouse in Opelika was seized by the federal government and demolished. The nightclub on Ocean Drive closed. The car dealership in Hialeah went bankrupt. Everything Vincent had built vanished as if it had never existed, but the cocaine kept flowing. Other men rose to fill the void, building their own empires, repeating the same cycle of violence and greed. Miami's cocaine wars continued through the 1980s, claiming hundreds of lives, corrupting law enforcement, poisoning communities. Vincent Castellano was just one name among many, a footnote in a larger story of American drug trafficking. In the end, the man who survived Vietnam, who clawed his way from Brooklyn to the heights of Miami's criminal underworld, who built an empire that moved millions of dollars and destroyed countless lives, died alone in the back of a van from a wound he inflicted on himself. He had escaped every trap, outwitted every rival, survived every war except the one he waged against his own demons. And that war, like all wars, ended the only way it could, in blood. Isabella Castellano grew up to be a teacher, like her mother. She never touched drugs, never broke the law, never sought revenge, or tried to rebuild her father's empire. She simply lived quietly, married a librarian, raised 2 children, and died at 73 in a nursing home in Orlando, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew that their great-grandfather had once been one of the most dangerous men in Miami. The empire was forgotten. The bodies were buried. And the only monument to Vincent Castellano's life was a death certificate that listed his cause of death as accidental blood loss. A final cruel joke from a universe that seemed determined to punish him even in his last moments. The knife that killed him was logged as evidence in case number 84, CR 327, stored in a federal warehouse in Alexandria, Virginia, where it remains to this day, gathering dust alongside thousands of other artifacts from crimes long forgotten. No one remembers it. No one cares. And Vincent Castellano, the man who wanted to build something that no one could take from him, left behind nothing but graves and scars and a daughter who learned to live without knowing the monster her father had become.